Well, good transition to the McCloskey case. More evidence came out of the McCloskey case this past week. The police officer investigating the case found evidence supporting the McCloskey defense. And the original assistant prosecutor was drafting a false probable cause affidavit, and the cop kept calling him on it. So the prosecutor threatened him, called him up and cussed him out, left a voicemail for him. We can guess who's leaking this stuff because we have the copy of the voicemail to the press. So, and threatened the police department, and demanded that the case be brought, quote, now, just a week before Election Day in St. Louis when the prosecutor got reelected. So it was clearly manipulation of the case for prosecutorial purposes, and he was willing to lie in the affidavit. And what's critical is here's the things he was going to say. He was going to say that wasn't a private street. He was going to say that the gate was open and that it was not broken into. He was going to say that it was completely peaceful. What the officer found from verified evidence on tape is that there were 4 separate threats made directly to McCloskey on videotape. One of them saying, we're going to come back to your house. Another one saying is, we're going to destroy your business. Another one talking about burning things down. And another one cussing and saying, we have a gun too. So basically the cop confirmed his case, and they were going to lie in the affidavit. He tried to get him to not lie in the affidavit. They still withheld evidence in the affidavit, all in order to get elected, for which she's yet to face any meaningful consequence. She got rewarded at the ballot box for it. So that's the disturbing situation that we find ourselves in. That's going to go down as one of the most egregious misconduct cases in history of a high-profile category.
You said something interesting before, is that, that there'll be the pushback when there's public outrage against the judicial activism. Okay. One thing I'm noticing, from the Flynn case is I'm not shocked by the amount of comments to this effect, but there's enough. People still saying he pleaded guilty. He's getting what he deserves. As though, it's such a, on the one hand, it's just a superficial understanding of the story and limited.
And it's legally wrong. Lawrence Tribe made that same mistake. He said, he's been convicted. I was like, come on, you teach criminal law at Harvard Law. You know that's not a conviction. Saying that you plan on pleading, which is what that was, but the plea is not decided until the final plea hearing, the plea is accepted. Until that point, that is an intention to plea under the law, but not in fact a plea, not a binding plea, not a final plea, until the plea hearing accepts the plea fully, which Sullivan had refused to do. The first judge who held a plea hearing had to disqualify himself, but didn't do so until after he took the plea. By law, that means that plea is null and void. So there never was, in fact, even a plea of guilty legally in the Flynn case. And of course, there's not a conviction until a judgment is issued. So you have these people misstating the law routinely. A lot of ex-federal judges doing it. I see they complained about the Flynn appeal decision. What I challenge all of those people to do is say, cite me one case in the 200-plus year of American legal history that has any of these facts where this took place, where a judge did what Sullivan did. There's none. They can't point to a single one. And that's their problem. Why are all these unprecedented events happening against people of a particular political persuasion? So has there been other bad political cases in U.S. history? Absolutely. To give you a little comparison, great new documentary out there. We'll put it in the links below, I think is the phraseology on YouTube. Called The Last Narc, available on Amazon. And what's interesting about this is one of the guys that gets a lot of flack for conspiracy theories, of course, is Alex Jones. But he was one of the very first people talking about this way back in like the late 90s. He had talked to some people who knew DEA agents, and he said that there's a famous case. It was made more famous in Narcos Mexico season 1 on Netflix, which it involves a DEA officer who was kidnapped, tortured, and killed in Mexico. One of the most famous cases like that in the history of the United States. Well, Jones was reporting in the late 90s that CIA people were involved and U.S. high-ranking officials were involved in the death, and that's the reason why the investigation always went sideways. Well, that he was, of course, that was all written off as, that's a crazy conspiracy theory. Well, the head investigator for the DEA, longtime law enforcement officer, has now come out and went on, and they have all the other key witnesses. And in fact, Felix Rodriguez, famous CIA, known as Max Gomez, is his alternate, all kinds of corrupt CIA activities back to the 60s, was actually one of the people torturing the DEA agent, and that someone within the DEA office in Mexico that was working with the DEA officer helped rat out and set him up to be tortured and killed. Backstory is what happened was the DEA agent stumbled into the beginnings of the CIA drug arms connection that was using the main Mexican drug cartel at that time in Guadalajara. He didn't know he had stumbled into it, but they were paranoid that he had. That's why they kidnapped him. That's why they tortured him. Then they find out he didn't know it, so they just kill him and blame the drug dealers who orchestrated the actions, who were not, in fact, the ones behind it. The ones behind it being high-ranking Mexican political and governmental officials and high-ranking officials within the CIA and a key person at the DEA. I started recognizing that Jones's theory was likely correct some years ago because I followed the case because they later on they would go and kidnap a doctor from Mexico, bring him back, and there was a big question about whether that was valid for personal jurisdiction purposes without an extradition treaty. Went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, United States v. McChain, decided 5-4 that they could in fact do it. I disagree with the Supreme Court decision, but because of that, I tracked that case. What's fascinating is he walked, and everybody walked. And they walked because a person celebrated in Narcos Mexico appears to me to have likely been on the Mexican cartel payroll all along and likely ratted out the DEA agent. They only hint at this in the new last Narc series. I suspected it because he got on the stand, was a high-ranking. They had successfully brought someone, extradited someone who was a major drug dealer who was connected to the murder, and he got up on the stand, the head DEA guy in Mexico during that time period, and said, "Oh, that guy was never a drug dealer." And everybody was shocked. The prosecution was shocked. Everyone else was shocked. Well, how did the defense lawyer know to ask that question? So my hunch is that was the guy that was on the take the whole time. That's interestingly enough celebrated in Narcos. It turned out he may have been the rat for the Mexican cartel all along. But it gives you an example of how criminal justice works. I mean, they covered up. No one was ever prosecuted successfully for that murder in the United States. And the key facts about it were covered up and hidden for 25 years until this officer decided to come forward and give the whole story. And they got fantastic. They got firsthand eyewitness evidence of the Mexican law enforcement officials that were part of the kidnapping, part of the execution of the kidnap, part of the whole thing. It's a fascinating documentary, and it's a reminder of the scope and scale to which our government will go to cover up their own corrupt misconduct, even when it involved the torture and murder of one of their best law enforcement officers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Almost too much to digest. What was the question I was going to ask? In the McCloskey case, the cop who came forward, has he been identified? Has he been publicly?
Oh yeah. I mean, technically, apparently these records are somehow disclosed through Freedom of Information Act or something. It came to the press. People can see the good 10-minute description on Matt Christensen, who I think comes up almost as we end, not long after his YouTube thing comes on. Occasionally we've stepped on him, so I'm trying to promote him a little bit. In terms of his time frame for his live stream. But yeah, he has a good 10-minute version of it, and apparently it comes from the supposedly FOIA request. But given how I know how those operate, here's the backstory in St. Louis. The prosecutor there is suing the police union. So the police and the prosecutor's office are at war in St. Louis. And so the cop was trying to do an honest job, put under great pressure, and he basically was not happy with how the prosecutor treated him. The prosecutor basically, the assistant prosecutor assigned the case, basically threatened the police department that he was going to increase the riot pressure by saying that they are the ones holding back evidence to be able to prosecute the McCloskeys. So that gives you the mindset. It also makes it how clear it is. The St. Louis prosecutor's office is in the pocket of Antifa, BLM, the rioters, and the looters. That they have been weaponized to promote the looters and the rioters against the interest of people who try to defend themselves. It could not be more clear than the evidence that's been released. But it's been released by local media there, and it has emails, it has voicemail recordings, it has a correspondence back and forth, it has all of it. Presumably, theoretically, not leaked but disclosed under FOIA. But that's the fastest FOIA response I think I've ever seen. So I'm still trying to get FOIA documents in the Amy Cooper case in New York. So in my other typical cases, they take months. And right now they're taking like a year. So that's because the St. Louis cops decided to pay back the prosecutor. And so that gives you an idea. That case is a joke. that they can't even go forward, because that means the lead cop on the case is going to get on the stand and exculpate McCloskeys. That's what that means. I think she only brought it to win election. I think she's probably going to let it go not long after.
What are the chances? I mean, can the feds get involved? How does this escalate? Who what's the word from The Simpsons? Who polices the police? I mean, literally, this is where we're at.
Only if there's a civil rights violation, which there's an argument that there is. The U.S. Attorney's Office from St. Louis could investigate the St. Louis Prosecutor's Office on grounds that they engaged in civil rights violations, a conspiracy to violate the civil rights of the McCloskeys, given what they did here. So, yeah.
And
I wouldn't bet on it. They're running around chasing stupid cases out of the federal prosecutor's office in St. Louis. So one of the weaknesses of the Trump administration has been that he has not reformed deep state apparatus. And what I mean by that is people who have key decision-making power in law enforcement, prosecutorial decision-making, intelligence, State Department, diplomacy. Almost all those people are controlled by people who hate Trump.
I would imagine not the only, but one of the good elements of this is that the people they've decided to do this to seem highly litigious and have the wherewithal to use the legal system and not put up with crap, and might push it as far as it can go. It's interesting. I don't believe that I've heard enough of this for as egregious as it is in the mainstream media.
Oh, no, they've completely buried this. If I hadn't come across Matt Christensen's thing, I wouldn't have known about it. So, I mean, that's how I mean, like, it's extraordinary. The amount of the places you have to dig to get honest information. Well, like, take Last Narc. When I saw Last Narc, I was like, do they really have these people? And I was like shocked. I watched the whole thing, like, what do you call it? I binged it right away. And I was like, wow, this is the best evidence of government misconduct in the history of it. Makes JFK look like the film Small Change. I mean, this is extraordinary kind of thing, but yet the mainstream press has hardly said a word about it. You have one of the biggest scandals in the history of United States politics, and the institutional press hasn't said boo. It's amazing how much they are in the pocket of the certain corrupt institutional actors. It's unfortunate.
It is. I mean, that's shocking. Someone had sent me the link and said look into it, and I could only see it summarily. And what I had read was that one of the police officers refused to reassemble or refused to alter the weapon that had been rendered unusable. But that
was just one of many parts of it. I mean, basically, he was trying to get the prosecutor to not lie in the probable cause affidavit. Gave him all the evidence that showed that, in fact, there was no basis to bring a charge at all. I mean, it was just, and all these people that were yipping to me on Twitter about, oh, that was a totally peaceful thing. There's no evidence it was criminal. Yeah, actually, there was. The law enforcement officer found 4 specific threats made directly to the McCloskeys on videotape. Also, of course, the gate was damaged. That is a private road. I mean, it was just one lie after another. Now, that tells you about what prosecutors are used to. They never get caught for lying to judges. No, judges just don't do anything about it. And watch, in this case, that there'll be nothing done to those prosecutors. Just like there's been nothing done to the prosecutors for lying to the judge in the Flynn case about discovery that clearly had been hidden that was exculpatory.
Okay, amazing. Actually, someone had asked a question earlier about Flynn. Sally Yates saying that Comey went rogue. Is that going to have any impact on the case?
Well, it's a great opportunity to remind everybody of the eternal truth. Sally Yates is corrupt.
There were two Robert.
Yeah, well, the second is Epstein didn't kill himself. So those two truths still true. But in the news again was the Sally Yates is corrupt one. She tried to lie and hedge to she tried to shift blame. It's interesting. There's now an institutional narrative. I think this is being orchestrated by Obama's people to blame Comey and to blame low-ranking people. They always look for the lowest person on the totem pole to feed to the machine. That's just the way the machine always works. They're like, can you? When I have a case, if I can give them somebody low on the totem pole in government misconduct, they're happy to give my client whatever he wants, and we get to walk. And their only remedy is always somebody low on the totem pole. I've got some people higher on the totem pole, but that's brutal to get to. So yeah, it's clear based on Rosenstein and Yates's statements that they are now blaming everything on Comey, on this younger lawyer named Kleinsmith, because they have him actually doctoring documents with easy proof. On McCabe, that's where the blame is going to go. Not to Brennan, not to Clapper, not to Yates, not to Biden, not to anybody high-ranking other than Comey to some degree. And Comey, of course, is also saying he was kept in the dark, and McCabe is saying he was kept in the dark. So, and Peter Strzok's even kind of saying he was kept in the dark. So, if anybody is hit, it's going to be Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, and Kleinsmith. I wish it was someone higher up, but that's just not the history of the government. Sadly, they just do not clean up their own. Even though it's now become more evident. I've been telling people now for 3 years that if you want to understand what the Steele dossier is all about, go and watch 2 movies or read 2 books by ex-spies turned literary authors, one Graham Greene, the other John le Carre. And the first one is called Our Man in Havana, black and white movie made right on the eve of Fidel coming into Cuba. And the 1990s movie Taylor of Panama. And the point of those is that what spies often do is just make stuff up. And they often find some local bogus source that actually doesn't have any connection to anybody, anywhere, any place, but just has a good imagination. And that's what they print up. And that's all the Steele. We now know this week that was all the Steele dossier ever was. He didn't even have a source in Russia. They didn't even have a source. He had a source with a Russian name, but was here in the United States working over at the Brookings Institution, who was just talking BS over beers. And he recorded this as prime source, Russia #1, close to Putin, and he knows that spy verbiage. And Steele mostly didn't. I mean, Steele wanted Trump out, but mostly Steele's just getting a huge paycheck. He knows that the crazier the story that feeds into the fevered imagination of his critics, the more people be, oh yeah, that's great, and it would pay him more and more and more. That's the scam, and that's what Our Man in Havana is all about. And the reason why it came from spies turned authors is both Graham Greene witnessed it when he was a spy in Africa during World War, I think it was World War I, maybe World War II, and then John le Carre witnessed it himself as well. And so they're like, this is how the spy world really is. It's 90% completely bogus. And that's what it turns out the Steele dossier was. They knew it the whole time. They lied about it. Sally Yates, I mean, the real conspiracy was launched with Sally Yates, Susan Rice, James Comey, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden in the Oval Office on January 5th. I mean, when Susan Rice is writing, the CYA emails on January 20th, like 1 minute before inauguration. By the way, on this meeting on the 5th, everything was totally legit and clean, and that you don't need to write that unless it was totally not legit and clean. She knew that they were going to be in trouble, and so that's who should be prosecuted. Probably none of them will be. Sally Yates tried to get around Senator Cruz, to his credit. Asked a good question. He's pointing out, weren't you spying on the Trump campaign? He's like, no, Carter Page wasn't an advisor at that point. And she's like, hold on. And he was like, hold on a second. You got a FISA warrant, right? And FISA warrants allow you to not only spy on that person, but anyone they've been in communication with, correct? And it allows you to go back in time when they were working on the campaign, correct? And so she just tried to lie about it in ways that works when you're talking to some 26-year-old kid writing at the New York Times or the Washington Post, but does not work with someone who knows anything about FISA. So she should be criminally prosecuted. She clearly was part of the setup of General Flynn, was clearly part of illicit authorization of illicit spying. Illicit unmasking was the other way they were doing spying, because unmasking is a way of spying without even getting a FISA warrant. All you do is say, oh, that conversation looks interesting. Tell me who that was. Because the NSA listens to everybody's conversations all the time, in case people haven't figured that out yet. Watch anything on Ed Snowden, and you'll understand what he was talking about. But the people who should be prosecuted: Brennan, who orchestrated it; Clapper, who orchestrated it; Yates, all of whom were likely involved with illicit leaks of confidential information; all of whom were involved with illicit unmaskings for politicized purposes; all of whom were involved in the conspiracy to spy on the Trump campaign and related associates and affiliates with it; all of them were involved with selling a bogus Russiagate narrative. Unfortunately, it is unlikely that any of them will actually face prosecution. Lindsey Graham waited to the last possible minute to do a hearing. He's only doing it to make sure he doesn't lose his reelection bid in South Carolina this November. The guy is just a fraud. He's not a serious guy. And anyone who takes him seriously is wasting their time. I told people that a year ago, as soon as he was going to be up on the Judiciary Committee. But given the dynamics of what was revealed this week about the subsources revealed just how embarrassingly bad we have had a real life Our Man in Havana, Taylor of Panama, actually happened in documented time here in the United States, and it's the Russiagate story.
It's amazing. I mean, that reminds me of a tweet that Brian Stelter just put out, which was him asking a panel whether or not there's any Is
there any network out there that just criticizes Donald Trump the way Fox is so mean to poor Joe Biden?
It was laughable, but it's
the guy's got. I'm starting to think he's a plant because he says the kind of things that are self-satire. You know what I mean? I mean, Mark Dice is already Mark Dice is going to have a permanent living mimicking his voice, Brian Stelter's voice. And now you have this. I mean, that was just, but to some degree, that's their self-delusion level. The echo chambers are as intense as ever. And the left, unlike the right, will always be bombarded with the left's news and knowledge because the left controls almost all the cultural institutions. I turn on Major League Baseball and I'm getting bombarded with BLM advertisements. I'm watching NBA and all of a sudden the guy's talking about one of those murderers in Louisville going to be indicted. And I'm like, okay, you're an NBA player. I really didn't tune in for your interpretation of the Breonna Taylor case. And my strong hunch is if we sit down and chat about it, you don't know much about the Breonna Taylor case. And if you're going to try to make a difference, find a case that's not all in the national news that will get you brownie points on Twitter. Find a legitimate case. I have several of them. Other lawyers have many of them across the country, maybe in your own hometown, that can make institutional reform possible. But that's the world we live in. These are people who live in so even when NBA ratings are shockingly declining in an environment they should be skyrocketing with everybody stuck at home, golf is hitting records. People are so turned off by the politics of what's happening in the sports. They're actually watching golf. I mean, there's no better evidence of the problem.
Well, golf, wait until bowling starts picking up because I've been watching bowling, but it's still not quite as aired as popularly as golf.
No, but it should be. It's more interesting to me than golf.
I love watching bowling. It's the perfect sort of repetitive motion to relax